kopanda. Greetings to all of you, those who have joined us for this Surplus Trust Policy Dialogue Forum, the fourth in 2021. This evening, we are looking at the Cartels report produced by Zimbabweans, who remain anonymous for security reasons, but we are grateful to Mark Haywood, who's one of our speakers today, for publishing it in Citizen Maverick. Looking at the report in terms of its impact on the political economy of Zimbabwe, but also we are looking beyond and asking the question, who are the accomplices and beneficiaries out there in the neighborhood, in South Africa, in the global north, as Uche calls it. And to help us today, we have as moderator, Tawanda Mtasa, who was one of our main presenters at the previous discussion on corruption, the political economy corruption a few months ago, or a few weeks ago. And we thought we'd bring him in back to lead us in the discussion. Tawanda is well-known Zimbabwean. I usually call him an international civil servant. He has been all over the place. One of our thought leaders, currently is at Paris School of International Relations, but we recognize him and acknowledge him as one of our thought leaders and leaders in the civic movement over the years. And one of those who are out there, the 75% I was talking about in the diaspora, who are sorely needed at home soon rather than later. Welcome, Tawanda. And we have Mark Haywood. Where's Mark? Our main presenter today, a human rights and social justice activist, editor of Maverick Citizen, Daily Maverick. And I noticed from your CV that you were in IMG at some stage. we must have been contemporaries in the 70s, in the heady days of the 70s. So welcome, Mark. Nice to meet you.
Thank you.
Khadija is delayed, Khadija Sharif, an investigative journalist. She has been on this forum together with Tawanda on corruption. She's done some fantastic work. My friend Patrick Smith I don't think he's joined us yet. Patrick Smith, I hope he joins us subsequently. From Africa Review and Africa Confidential. Then my home girl, Annie Barbara Chikwana, a Zimbabwean academic, professor at UJ. She's done some work in this field, and that's why we have brought her in, thanks to Tony Rila, who remembered her work. And special welcome to Michelle Gavin, a senior fellow for African Studies at the Council of Foreign Relations. We read a lot about you, Michelle, and we're glad that you came on to assist us in this discussion. The last but not least is my brother Uche Igwe, who I discovered through Facebook and through his work and his article on the subject. Professor at Firoz Laji. Where is that, Uche? You'll tell us later. But Uche is from Nigeria. And
Firoz Laji Center for Africa is at the London School of Economics.
Okay, LSE. Okay. So this is our team, and I would like to hand over now to Tawanda. Take over, please, Tawanda.
Thank you very much, Ibo. And I would like to also appreciate the music that you led with. I think our artists are quite important. We just lost Bunny Wailer, of course, the last of the triumvirate of Wailers. And I know some of those that appreciate his music, such as Eva Joyce Wynn, we're remembering with me and others, when he's saying his music was telling history, telling the truth, you know, protecting the innocent and making sure that the infants are strong and so on. well before, as a global community, we were thinking about the SDGs. He was already articulate on all these things. So it's good that you led with that. So we'll go straight into the conversation today, and we appreciate the publication of the Cartel report by Mark and the Daily Maverick. And Mark will lead in the conversation. Essentially, we are looking at a situation where the statistics are dire, even by government's own admissions. In terms of the Auditor and Comptroller General's report, as way back as 2012, we had significant irregularities in the way public finances are managed in Zimbabwe. And at that point in time, it was estimated that about $3.4 billion of money had moved from the General Exchequer to the Paymaster General without clear audit, and that this amount was not available for any auditing. And we know that even beyond 2017, in the analysis that was done by the Zimbabwe Coalition on Debt and Development, they saw that in the 2018 Auditor General's report, at least 82% of government expenditure had some kind of financial irregularity or another. And these are the kinds of things that we are looking at. We do know that even by conservative estimates, we have had food insecurity consistently, ranging from at least 27% to, if you are looking at 2019 figures by the World Bank, close to 50% of people being food insecure. And one could go on. But in the context of all this, we have also seen what the cartel detailed in terms of the level of siphoning of resources from the Zimbabwe economy, the rent seeking that's taking place, the collusion that is taking place among a number of actors that our panelists will speak to, that I won't go into in detail. And we have also seen, of course, the impact of all this on social services in Zimbabwe, as well as the impact on slowing the democratization efforts, shrinking the civic space, and so on and so forth. So focusing today on the external dimensions of this, the regional dimension, South Africa, the neighborhood, Southern Africa, DRC, Africa, the world, Dubai, you know, all these spaces is precisely what we are focusing on. And to lead us in that will be Mark Haywood. And without further ado, I would like to open it up now for Mark's presentation. Over to you, Mark.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you, Tawanda and Ibo, for the introduction, as well as for hosting this evening's discussion focusing on the cartel power dynamics report. I have to say at the outset that I feel that in some ways, by rights, I shouldn't be on this panel. It should be the authors of the report. But as Ibo said at the outset, because of the political climate that exists in Zimbabwe, because of the clamping down on civic space, because of the arbitrary arrests and abductions, the authors chose to publish this report anonymously, as is their right. And I chose, as a social justice and human rights outlet, to publish it as Maverick Citizen, because I believe that there is a public interest in doing so. But I want to say at the outset that in their absence, I would like to commend the authors for putting together such a comprehensive, well-researched report that is stimulating debates and discussions about cartel capture, state capture, abuse of state resources, not only in Zimbabwe, but across the region and indeed across the world. I think that it is interesting that the responses to this cartel dynamics report didn't only come from within Zimbabwe. They came from members of the US Senate, they came from members of parliament in the United Kingdom, and from other interested parties all over the world. But my hope is that this will lead to more than just a momentary discussion, but that it may contribute to deeper change in Zimbabwe, which is why, again, I'm happy to speak less about the report, which as I said, I'm not an author of, but more to the question of what about the accomplices and beneficiaries next door in my country, South Africa, and further afield. But I also want to say, because the report has been criticized and attacked from some predictable quarters, that I published it because of its public importance to Zimbabwe, to South Africa, and to the international community. I think that it is necessary for journalists to take steps sometimes that may draw ire and draw criticism, particularly when it is in the public interest. I was one of the recipients of the now famous hard drive from the Guptas in South Africa that contained 200,000 emails detailing state capture in this country. Those days I wasn't working for the Daily Maverick, I gave it to the Daily Maverick. But I think that you can see the power of exposure, the power of publicity, and the power of information in generating consequence for unlawful action, and in particular unlawful action that, as Tawanda said in his introduction, has enormous societal consequences for poverty and for poor people in particular. So although the report is about Zimbabwe and about cartel power dynamics in Zimbabwe, I think it's obvious to any reader that the cartel system that it describes in Zimbabwe could not exist if its tentacles did not stretch beyond the borders of Zimbabwe, particularly immediately over the border of the Limpopo River into South Africa, but also beyond the borders of Southern Africa into countries or into places like Dubai, which managed to operate frequently outside of the rule of law. The other thing that I think is important to understand about this report at the outset is that this type of capture, and this was something that I recognized when I was first given this report and I began to consider publishing it and looking at it, is that the type of cartel capture that it describes may have reached a very advanced form in Zimbabwe, but it is by no means unique. And as I'll say in my comments in a few minutes' time, there are very specific instances where there's almost copycat behavior in South Africa in terms of unlawful collusion between political elites and business elites in order to draw rent and to remove that rent for private interest. So what we have here is a report that is a report that's certainly almost unique for the world, because it gives you an X-ray of a particular type of conduct of political elites, of this collusion that I talked about, and that X-ray is of your country in Zimbabwe. But the X-ray is of a disease, of a pathology that is goes way beyond Zimbabwe itself. Now, before I move on to the questions about South Africa and beneficiaries beyond South Africa, I do want to spend 5 minutes on the report itself. And I want to stress a couple of things. That, first of all, I would not have publish this report if I did not think that the report is factual and that the report is accurate. What those people present on this policy dialogue who have seen the report, and I hope most people have seen the report, will realize is that in some ways there's not much that is new in this report. It's not, its power, its sensationalism doesn't come because it tells us something that wasn't known about before. Its power comes from the fact that it takes a wealth of information that has been in the public domain and in the media, and it joins the dots in order to draw a picture that can allow the public to better understand what is taking place and what is the real cost of what is taking place. The report has, and to bear out what I've just said, the report has 462 references. It reads more like an academic paper in certain respects. And I will say, because I've been challenged on this ground, but I would not have published this report if it was not fact-checked and if it was not independently fact-checked. And I think that it is significant that although there has been some criticism of the report by people implicated in the report, I have not seen a serious attempt to discredit the substance and the content and the framework and the argument, the political and economic argument that this report contains. And I'm sure we would all be glad when that were that critique to emerge, and particularly were that critique to emerge from the ruling party, from ZANU-PF in Zimbabwe, and from some of the economic actors and from some of the cartels that have been fingered directly by this report. So I think that is an important thing to understand. As I said, there have been a number of protests about some of the things that the report says, but my answer to those protests is to draw the protesters to the footnotes to those reports, as well as to the fact that there are a whole number of publications, including, for example, just 2 books that I have found recently detailing one aspect, or in much greater detail, one aspect of the cartel that exists around tobacco and that stretches from Zimbabwe into the region. And the people who are making criticisms of the report are named in this book and are named in another book written by a former South African Revenue Services employee, Johan van Lochrenberg, who was driven out of the revenue services because of corrupt interests in South Africa. So I feel confident in the main conclusions that have been reached by this report. So what does the report do? It provides an anatomy of state capture. It provides, as I said in the introduction that I wrote when we published the report, a post-mortem of the Zimbabwean body politic that explains what is the pathology that killed the democratic dream. You know, it's easy to put fingers on individual politicians who have behaved unlawfully and unethically over many years and who have enriched themselves, including former President Mugabe and many members of his parliament, of his cabinet, including the present president. But there's more to the story than just the subjective behavior of corrupted individuals. The point to understand is that there is a system that supports this corrupt behavior, and the system serves certain interests. And in this interest, it is a system where of profit, of rent seeking, of abusing public resources for private gain, and then using private resources to shore up public power in order to then continue with a vicious circle so that public power can assist private gain and so on and so on. And to that extent, the report suggests links between political elites, between business elites, and it shows the means by which Zimbabwe's fiscus and natural resources are diverted into private hands. Now, again, I would challenge the people and the institutions that are mentioned in the resources that one of the things that Zimbabwe would benefit from at the moment would be the type of independent inquiry into state capture that is taking place in South Africa. The best thing for accused persons, accused institutions, would be that all the evidence and the counter evidence is placed on the table through a judicial commission in order to close this chapter so that Zimbabwe can live up to the promises of the 2013 constitution. I think that what the report also shows is that despite so much of the rhetoric of anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, post-colonialism, that what it shows is how certain elites that existed before 1980 adjusted to the democratic dispensation in a manner that allowed them to scratch the backs of the new power and at the same time retain their interests and their grip over important parts of the economy, and how in some cases those very same people then were able to make a further adjustment in 2017 and to accommodate to the new president and to the new factions that rule the country and continue to preserve private interests and private positioning to collude, to set prices, to fix prices, to under-declare exports, to manipulate currency reserves, and so on in the way that is described in the report. As you know, and for the people who haven't read the report, it provides 5 case studies of tobacco, of agriculture, of roads, of gold and diamonds. Each case study is worth discussion in itself. But again, as I said when I started my introduction, one of the things that struck me was the similarities to South Africa. I see very distinct similarities between the capture of Zinara by Univern and the capture of PRASA in South Africa, the public rail organization in South Africa, even to the degree of Zinara buying snow graders and PRASA buying trains that don't fit on our railways from China in order to exact rents. I haven't seen a rebuttal from Univern, for example, to the claims that are made in the report, or from Zinara, even though the amounts involve tens of millions of US dollars that are diverted from road maintenance and road construction into private pockets and out of the country. I see similarities between Eskom, our electricity generator, and I think it's called ZESCO, although it's not mentioned in the report, the Zimbabwe Energy Corporation. And again, how state-owned enterprises and parastatals with the billions of rands or Zim dollars or US dollars that go through them, if they're not closely overseen, become rich pickings for corrupt individuals. And finally, I would say on the report itself, Tawanda has said it, is that these types of corruption and collusion and cartel behavior, both lawful and unlawful behavior, do not result in victimless crimes. They result, the people who, if you like, buy or pay the price are the poor. And for me, this report begs the question, what's next? What is going to come of the findings in this in this report? Now, I'm obviously not in a position, nor would I want to speak for Zimbabwe about how Zimbabwe processes this report. I did send a copy to the Zimbabwe Anti-Corruption Commission, although there was no response. But I would like to say in the last 5 or so minutes of my introduction, a few comments about its implications for South Africa and its implications internationally. I think the first thing to say is obviously that South Africa is one of the largest catchment areas for the people, the ordinary people who are displaced by the crisis in Zimbabwe, by this cartel behavior, and that the pressure that this has created in South Africa is behind the horrible xenophobic behavior that we have witnessed by South Africans against Zimbabweans and against other people from Africa. And I've always wanted to say to poor South Africans who turn on undocumented and documented migrants from countries like Zimbabwe that they are turning on the wrong people, because it is not the ordinary people of Zimbabwe that have created this crisis, but in fact, complicity for this crisis, complicity for economic migration of people who leave home against their own wishes to leave home and leave a country that is rich in mineral resources, rich in agricultural resources, that is quite capable of sustaining its own population, that the complicity often lies with governments that willingly prop up the undemocratic regime that exists in Zimbabwe. Now, if you look at South Africa, I believe that South African government and business, and let me underline, put in bold, and business, are both deeply complicit politically and economically for the cartel behavior that's described and for the social and economic crisis of Zimbabwe. They are complicit politically because the ANC and our government, and I should say, in case anybody worries, that I've been a member and activist of the ANC from when I was 13 years old. So I'm not coming from an opposition political party making these points, has literally propped up ZANU-PF from the suppression and the hiding of the Kampepe report into the 2000 elections, through to the tailor-made Motlanthe Commission findings, and most recently through to the envoys sent by President Ramaphosa and people like Ace Makashule's Tea Party with ZANU-PF leaders, fraternal Tea Party, and attempts to deny that there is a social or that there is an economic crisis in your country, and to suggest that this is a fabrication and an invention of the media or an invention of the West. It is so clearly not. And I think that the onus is on civil society in South Africa to make our government respond to countries and governments like Zimbabwe in accordance with the spirit of our own constitution and our own human rights. And I make it as a criticism of us in South Africa, and particularly of activists in civil society, that there is no longer enough solidarity, enough paying of attention to how South Africa's government's actions can have negative ramifications for people beyond our borders. So there's a political complicity, but there's also an economic complicity. The cartel project, particularly in areas like tobacco, described in the report, gold mining, diamond smuggling, is very much dependent on business partners outside of Zimbabwe. It is very much dependent upon the South African market, for example, for tobacco, market which has again grown in the COVID-19 period, but it is also dependent upon corruption in the police, in border authorities, in the revenue services, and in our own business and our own business community. You know, one of the things, as I've been further investigating since publishing this report, these issues, is that it's a striking thing that people know who's doing this. People know how tobacco is coming into the South African market. They know who the people are involved, but there's a turning of a blind eye to what is going on. And I think that if there was intolerance of all of the above, the cartel capture project would be far more fragile and vulnerable and less sustainable and less profitable than it is. And therefore, there would have been much greater pressure for economic reform from a much earlier point than has been the case. So I want to conclude just by suggesting a couple of steps that need to happen. You know, a lot of the report in response in South Africa to this report has focused on Zimbabwe. I believe it needs to focus on South Africa. I believe that the answers for the international community when it comes to the rights and the dignity of people in Zimbabwe is not necessarily just sanctions, which is the easy way out for governments such as those of the United Kingdom and the United States, etc., because those sanctions overlook the fact, as I've tried to say, and as this report suggests, that there's a system that is supporting this. Now, I'm not saying that there shouldn't be sanctions, but I'm saying that sanctions are not sufficient. What is needed is better accountability, better transparency. What is needed is consequence. What is needed is better policing of business, more oversight of business, more compliance by business with international law, less tax evasion, less illicit financial transactions and transfers. And all of those things are within the power of Zimbabwe's trading partners, South Africa's trading partners, developed country governments, and within the power of the business community. And I believe that if we are talking about what the external response to this crisis should be, then it would help a great deal if there was more focus on those particular areas. But I think also just more oversight. I mean, I fear, you know, in journalism, that what happens is you have an expose, people go onto the defensive for a few weeks, maybe a few months, and then the issue goes out of the public eye, and then the old behaviors reorganize themselves, regroup, and it just continues as it was before. And I guess the challenge that you face with this report is, does this report become a watershed moment, or does it simply become another blip on the landscape, on the political landscape of the crisis in Zimbabwe? And the very final point that I would say to my own community in South Africa of activists and of civil society organizations and NGOs is that we need to rebuild the bonds of solidarity with civil society in Zimbabwe. You know, a lot of work in South Africa deals with the migrant crisis, with migration, with supporting refugees who are victims of xenophobia, and all of that is important and it needs to continue, but it's not sufficient. We are very interconnected regionally. Our fates are very much dependent upon each other. And I believe that the dismantling of the cartel capture project in Zimbabwe will benefit the dismantling of the same project in Zambia, the same project in Namibia, same project in Angola, and the same project in South Africa, and will make it possible to actually ensure that the rights that are granted to our peoples under our constitutions are more than just paper rights. So thank you for the opportunity to just introduce this discussion today, and for holding the discussion. I'll stop my comments now. Thank you very much, Tawanda.
Thank you very much, Mark. That's really profound, and I think you've covered a lot of ground there that was necessary to cover. I think where you ended is actually quite important, that there is, of course, the risk that this can be a 9-day wonder, like many other things. It's an important report. But it needs to be as watershed as it actually is, because in many ways the fact that it consolidates a lot of evidence across the footnoting, the referencing that, or the endnoting that you have indicated, the fact that these are not crimes without consequences or without victims, but they are real people that are experiencing the difficult end of what we are seeing detailed in the report. And the fact that a number of these things are actually continuing in many respects, including the current Chilonga Denderi crisis, which actually indicates, of course, that the collusion between politicians and certain business people or business interests to the exclusion of the livelihoods, the dignity, the ancestral land rights, the cultural rights, the very sustenance of communities. And I think it's therefore awfully important that you are encouraging that the advocacy should continue, and we should revisit that towards the end in terms of how we make sure that the focus does not wane beyond this particular report. So I'll proceed in a moment to the next panelist. But I just wanted to acknowledge a few things that Mark mentioned that I think would really be important to not lose. I think the fact that particularly in terms of South Africa, the relationship is actually so intricate and so closely tied, including that what you are seeing in the Zondo Commission across the Limpopo River is precisely the kind of thing that this report is demonstrating. The fact that right from the outset, we should be looking at a reading of the report in South Africa, which does not just focus on what needs to be done on the other side, but also what needs to be done within South Africa itself by South African publics, by South African civil society, in terms of pressure by the South African Parliament, in terms of uptaking some of the recommendations, and by the South African state more broadly. And then that also, of course, has implications for other countries beyond South Africa, including in relation to what countries do with the responsibility for curbing corruption that is perpetrated or carried out by entities that are registered in their own domains or their own jurisdictions. The kinds of things that we have seen in the wake of the Dodd-Frank Act and so on and so forth, which I think Michelle, Patrick, and colleagues will also want to speak to. So I thought that was an important point to mention. And then I appreciated very much your link of the private and the public nexus in the way that the report does, which is the way we are seeing the incentives for rent seeking and for the collusion that's happening and the work of cartels as being about people seeking to make private gain from public office, but also using that private gain intent to hold power in the public domain. And it's a vicious cycle that is continued. So that does go to demonstrating that the effects are not just economic, they are not just in terms of people's livelihoods, they are not just in terms of what's happening to poor people, they are also on the very security, integrity of Zimbabwe as a nation state and on democratization itself. So there are profound impacts of state capture that we are looking at here. So we'll move on then now to Professor Anish Kwana, and after that to Patrick Smith. So Annie has been introduced already, but it has also been good that Annie has been in a number of circles where the emphasis really in terms of the Institute for Security Studies, the South African Institute for International Affairs, Afrobarometer Network, and so on, and their own current space. Those spaces are about research and evidence-based analysis. So it's also good that we have not only the point that Mark was making, that he published this report precisely because there is no basis he had for doubting its veracity, but also the fact that we can have an input from somebody who is steeped in a research background, and including and if you have any critique of the report, we would really want to hear it from where you sit. So over to you, Anne.
Good afternoon or good evening, everybody. And thank you for the invitation to be part of this panel. Now, the first thing I want to applaud the team that put this report together for is the fact that they actually took into account the need to use conflict-sensitive methodologies and protect all those that needed to be protected. And that point alone speaks to the fact that all of us who have done research in Zimbabwe since about 2000, we have always had to stick to such methodologies. And that speaks volumes about the nature of the system that we are speaking about. So it really does show the courage, finally, by Zimbabweans to actually write on these transgressions. Initially, people talked and walked in the streets, but now they're actually putting it in record so that when we look back in time, we will be able to say that this was documented before. Action might not have been taken, but we have it written down. And so those archives will prove important for future generations. Now, secondly, I just want to echo and support Mark on what he said about that this is not a Zimbabwean phenomenon only. It is a regional, if not a global phenomenon. If you remember, some of you might have read the book McMafia by Misha Glenn, which also speaks to similar trends and state capture, economy, everything during the Milosevic regime and that region as a whole. But now when you look at our case in Africa in particular, I've done research in countries where you go to the investment center and you are scrutinizing their books, you are assessing governance, and you want to look at the number of investments that have come in a certain period, maybe last 5 years, and you'd expect a comprehensive record of who invested, the amount invested, what exactly they are doing, where they are doing it, and what is happening to the output. But in 3 countries that I worked in, there was no data, no information at all on anything related to mining investments, in particular, the extractive sector. All mining investments are signed off by the president at his house, not even necessarily the office. And I remember one presidential person defending that and saying that this is of national interest. He's acting as the custodian, of our natural resources for the public. That doesn't make sense, because what we do know is happening behind the scenes is that he's getting a lot of facilitation fees, signing on fees, and the country will never ever get to know what the real deal is. How much was invested or not invested, or how much is being pulled out, and where it is ending up, and if anything comes back at all. So to begin with, it is really a major problem and a weakness for many African governments. And I'll come back to this at the end when I talk about the responsibilities of our regional economic groups. Now, sorry, I'm hearing.
Can I just check maybe if somebody can mute? There is an interference that is coming now. So for colleagues that have just joined, if you could please mute, thank you.
Okay. Now, the third point that I want to talk about has to do with information that I actually think should have been added to the report. I'm very much convinced that you know, it speaks truth to power and is quite accurate, because I have also gone through the same issues in conducting research in Zimbabwe, and people talk just like our oral traditions. It's stories that are told here, but they have substance, these stories, and they have people behind them, and of course they are victims, as has been said. So I do not doubt the substance, the contents of the report. And I would like to believe that if somebody were to repeat it, still using conflict-sensitive methodologies, which are, of course, usually criticized by some, you will find that they will come up with a more or less similar report with more or less similar information, because this information, since it transcends borders, you'll find that there's a lot of it out there, just out of Zimbabwe itself. So you cannot even begin to say that this is people who are dissatisfied with governance, dissatisfied with the regime, or opposition, people who are just wanting to make noise. Cartels have been the fulcrum of ZANU-PF staying power. It's not a recent development. It has always been like that. It just took us a long time to notice this and to get to this point, because now we can really see the impact with the naked eye. We see the poverty. We see poverty on the move. We see people moving around. You see homelessness. You see problems, urban decay, issues that we didn't see before, that were all masked by some other relative developments that were going on. But going back in history, right at the beginning, you find that cartels were really, the pivotal, center for the development of ZANU-PF staying power. Now, the problem is that, cartels always have inbuilt mechanisms, which allow everybody within the cartel system to cheat. And the problem with us in Zimbabwe is that this has, expanded so much that there's extensive splintering. Our report, well, this report here, now I'm saying our report as if I was part of it, no, although I accept the report. Now, this report speaks at a very high level, but if you look at what goes on beneath those, high levels, you will then really understand the disruptive power of cartels, at the local level, the very poor, ordinary citizens. Now, this splintering has affected all sectors. And this takes me to the level that I want to speak to, the street level cartels. Here we heard about the national level cartels that are dealing in all the major visible issues. But go deeper, you will find these cartels exist in every facet of life in Zimbabwe, socio-economic life, etc. Now, here by street level, I'm speaking to the other ordinary small officials and to the ordinary people who invoke the name of the party in order to get their way and, of course, to create rents for themselves. Now, this has created a hierarchy, an entire hierarchy of extortion in the country. And it has been extensive enough to reach the low ranks, in the rural areas, the peasantry. We speak of state capture, institutional capture, etc. But even the peasants, our peasant farmers, our small scale farmers, peasants might be politically incorrect, but that's exactly what their mode of production is about. They have been captured by these cartels. For instance, speaking from some kind of experience in Zimbabwe, you find that even the village head has power to extort and demand from the villagers. If there is a funeral in his household, some demand contributions, money, payments. If you are in a farming community, they demand donations. If you keep sheep, chickens, whatever, they ask for that, as your contribution to a funeral. Everybody has funerals in their homes. I don't see the reason why people need to contribute to the headmen's. And after that, it's not just the headman who needs it. Then there is the chief. He will also demand his share. When there's crisis in the member of parliament's family, a death or anything, the same expectation again, it comes out, and the demand weighs heavily on the citizens. So this extraction, it's quite a massive hierarchy. It's got tentacles everywhere. It doesn't matter what the occasion is. It's a funeral or it's a political party event. Everything becomes disruptive, and for people who try to eke out, a living, by foraging for whatever they can, people pretty much scavenge every day in Zimbabwe to come up with $1 to buy dinner and $1 again to buy breakfast the next morning, and life goes on. And then they have this burden imposed on them. This mostly happens out of sight of the activists and the journalists in the rural areas. And I think this is an important element that should also be addressed, the whole issue of street level cartels and the way these opportunities were opened up by these other higher up level cartels that gave them the room, because everybody has their own runners, and these runners also abuse the power. So it just goes on endlessly to the point that it becomes difficult to secure a table at an ordinary market without paying some pretty much protection money to somebody in these cartel systems, because they are the youth of this party in here, the vanguards of democracy there, or whatever it is they are protecting. And so it goes on, it's endless, it permeates every aspect of life, and that is very, very disruptive and deters all Zimbabweans from achieving their maximum potential, because everything they try to grasp onto is taken away, or is chipped at by this greed, that is exemplified by these cartels. Now, how then, have citizens, the public responded to this? How has monitoring been going on? I see the report suggests that the NGOs can do reports, etc. There was a very good attempt, I remember, by the CNRG, Center for Natural Resource Governance, I believe, in 2011-12. I read a very good comprehensive report on illicit financial flows in Zimbabwe. And they documented the sources and tracked everything, right through to the ends. I don't know what happened to that momentum. I think it died an unnatural death, as happens with a lot of such initiatives. But you can see that the capability is there to generate shadow reports, and, document all these issues. Nothing happens without somebody knowing what is going on. I remember driving once from Harare to Bindura, to Mount Darwin, to Mutoko. And the people in the car would point out, that mine is owned by so-and-so, this is so-and-so's son, and that one is owned by so. And these are just ordinary people like myself who point out these possessions and who owns them and who, so it's you, when you begin to absorb it, you just begin to think that it doesn't make sense. It's not so few can own so much or own everything in the country, but that is the reality. And villagers, workers, people know, they've just always been too scared to speak. So for them to be able to have given information to this report, I think I applaud that very much. And I think that is the best way to go. It will take time before there can ever be a whistleblowing protection mechanism in place. But I think this is a step in the right direction. Now, Zimbabwe ratified the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance. And that already opens up space for the civil society organizations and a lot of other actors to scrutinize all these ongoings in the country. Now, we know that the ZACC is comprehensive, is inclusive of everything, including corporate governance, and the reports are supposed to be submitted every 2 years by each country, even though to date in the whole of Africa, only Togo has submitted a report 10 years after the ZACC came into effect, the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance. But our NGOs in Zimbabwe can make use of this space. They all know that there is space in the African Governance Platform for civil society input, and they can use that space to trigger debate or draw attention to these issues. There's nothing that stops them from writing shadow reports on each and every protocol of the African Union. It is the human rights protocol, the gender, the natural resource governance, adherence to the African mining vision, everything is in there. And we are just not taking advantage of this opportunity. Of course, we may say, okay, but then the AU's reaction has always been lukewarm to such initiatives, or sometimes it just chooses not to see these happenings. Same can be said about ZACC, and of course the death of the ZACC tribunal will always feel that. But I think social media platforms actually give a chance to rise above all these obstacles, to rise above all the brutality, because you can be anonymous and still make your point, heard. I think just every morning I have a ritual of tracking Twitter events here in South Africa, and a little in Zimbabwe, because you find a lot of things sometimes it's not the substance that you crave to get, but I can understand the fear of people in speaking so much and being targeted. But there are many ways, of skinning this cat here and revealing all this information. And with so many people having access to smartphones, we should be able to be getting a lot more information. It is not normally encouraged to do clandestine things, but I think there's nothing wrong with taking clandestine photos of an operation that is illegal in order to draw attention to all these issues that divert the resources that we need for development, especially in the case of Zimbabwe, because there is no sector that you can say is prospering. Everything needs resuscitation, everything has fallen apart, there's just angst everywhere, and everything needs attention all at once, and that's enough to paralyze any government or any efforts, because it's too much of what needs to be done. It's everything. And so the problems of secrecy, around issues in Zimbabwe, secrecy around all operations, secrecy, around, I don't even want to call it tenders, because I don't think it's even proper tendering systems that are in place, the awarding of contracts, the whole culture of secrecy. This goes way back since I was a girl as well. It's not a new thing. And we've all just, grown up and stepped into these shoes of this secrecy and fear. If you check data from like the Afrobarometer surveys in Zimbabwe, they have spoken consistently of fear and mistrust. And of course, everybody, almost everybody, except maybe just like 12–15% do not, say they do not know anything about corruption in the higher echelons of government in Zimbabwe. Consistent reports speak of the high levels of corruption, and you can see that citizens have sort of become disinterested, to a stage. Some end up saying, I don't know, it's not like anything will happen. If you were to ask people, do you have any faith, that this will change? The majority of citizens, if they're not too scared, will tell you that no, things will not change. Therefore, each man for himself, we go on with our own businesses. And if I have to pay a little money to do this, then I'll do that. Because in the latest survey alone 2020, over almost 30% of Zimbabweans admitted to paying bribes to get a service. And this is the kind of street level corruption that is really detrimental for the ordinary citizen. And you can see that there are some lower levels of cartels working at that level as well. Having read some reports here in South Africa, where you find that cartels like at the border posts are organized in such a way that all the money that is collected from people passing by without documents, etc., is put into one pool and shared at the end of the day, so that everybody gets their equal share and everybody is a team player. I wouldn't, rule out such kind of cartels at the service delivery point level in Zimbabwe, because how can it be that in every sector, you want to get a license for this, I simply call somebody, they go to the office and they sort it out for me. You want a specific service, you have to approach somebody. If you don't know somebody, what do you do then? What happens to you? And this is the plight of the majority of our citizens. So social media platforms give us this platform, for invisible participation. They give us that chance to reveal all these issues, hiding behind a veil of protection in order to reveal these unholy and ungodly secrets that have pulled down Zimbabwe. Lastly, I think my 10 minutes is up, but lastly, I think we also need to admit that Zimbabwe, just like most African countries, do not have the capacity to track illicit financial flows because of the sophisticated methods that are utilized by the foreign companies and that work in collusion with the political leadership in most cases. I have done research in countries where you find that their entire accounting for the extractive sector is done by seconded expatriates from the UK in most cases, depending on the country where it is. And so if somebody is accounting, doing the accounting, assisting you, say in the, maybe in the Auditor General's office, they are producing that report for you, what does it mean about your capacity? Do you even know how much you have beneath the surface there that is being extracted? Do we have that capacity to even, I think we do have, but do we have the willpower to send our geologists, locally trained, to go down there and make estimates of what it is that we are going to extract from there for how many years and what do we expect to get out of it? So we lack, in so many respects that it becomes difficult to then point out these people and say, yeah, but you have taken out $5 billion. We are making very rough guesstimates, and I think this is way below what is actually being taken out. And that said, I think it is important that CSOs use the African governance architecture frameworks designed by the African Union to make noise about the issue of secrecy, transparency, and lack of accountability, by the political leadership in many of these issues and in dismantling these cartels. How would the next AU Heads of State Summit respond to perhaps, say, reports from 3, 4, 5 countries that are all speaking on the same thing about these cartels that expose the shenanigans of the leadership? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Annie. That's brilliant and very, very clear points that you raise, ranging from the community impact of this cartel behavior, not just in terms of the immiseration of Zimbabweans, but also the kind of behaviors that are then fostered on the ground in terms of extractive, rent-seeking, exploitative relationships that are spawned from the kinds of political economy that cartel behavior engenders. And your emphasis also right at the end on our agency, basically, and saying, look, I mean, we should not give up. There remains many spaces and many possibilities for doing things, including utilizing the African system in terms of not just the Constitutive Act and some of its expectations and possibilities, but also instruments and mechanisms such as the democracy, elections and governance framework, and the reporting frameworks that we have within the African Union, but also even the possibilities of what can be done at the multilateral, including UN levels. So it's good that I think you are again demonstrating there the urgency that we can have, that ordinary people can play, that civil society can play in the different countries. And then I also appreciated very much the way you helped us understand some of the sort of conflict sensitivities that go with research of this nature and analysis into the way the report tries to cover what is going on, but at the same time being protective of communities, of voices, but there is a reality of very substantive evidence that communities are able to give from their testimonies on a day-to-day basis. You cited, for instance, the community natural resource governance work and framework, and community advocate and researcher Farai Magu has, for instance, documented some of the ways in which Chinese people have gone into Dinde, for instance, on the 11th of June 2020, Chinese, a group of Chinese went into the village in the company of Chief Charles Nekatambe, one Mr. Ngube, and the Chilota Colliery Company, limited proprietor, Mr. Lazarus Kwidini. And you can then see the villagers on the one side and their own chief together with the Chinese on the other, and the machinery, as it were, staked against them. So it is important for us to explode the myth that when we are talking about these things, the issue is sovereignty and it is white and black and so on and so forth. What we are seeing in cases like Denderi, what we are seeing in this example of what Farai Magu was documenting in India in terms of the chief coming in with a few Chinese who had been going on, picking things and prospecting without talking to any villager. It's basically poor people on the one hand, poor Zimbabweans who are disenfranchised, who are not respected, who are rendered voiceless, and on the other, those who have power, colluding with anybody who helps them to prop up their power. Whether that person be white, black, or green has not been an issue for them. And I think it's important for us to remain very clear-eyed about the nature of the beast in that sort of way. So proceeding then from there, it is also of interest to then look at some of the international dimensions beyond Africa. And I would like to invite Patrick Smith to come in. And Patrick, you were introduced by Ibo just before you arrived, but we are aware of the contributions that Africa Confidential has been making over the years, including your access often into very detailed and very helpful data that is not available in the open source public domain. So it will be interesting to hear your perspective as you look at the implications of the cartel report beyond Zimbabwe and in the wider world. Over to you, Patrick.
Thanks, Tawanda. Yeah, I guess I would emphasize the importance of the internationalization of these operations. What John Christensen of the Tax Justice Network has called the pinstripe army of consultants, lawyers, auditors, accountants who make this really possible. Of course, most of those are based in the West. In fact, quite a few are based in London, New York, Geneva, of course. And I think, they're always a good source of information for journalists, because every now and again you get somebody in these institutions who, develops a conscience about what's going on and wants to talk about it. The other thing that happens is that quite a lot of these companies fall out with each other. For example, in Zimbabwe, you've got a good case of the empire of the late John Bredenkamp fell out with the empire of Billy Rottenberg, and they started feeding journalists information about their rival empires. And in that way, we were able to build up a very good picture of what each of them was up to, and even put their own allegations to their rivals. So I think it's really important to get a sense of how these organizations operate, and the effective response. It's been said about the issue of solidarity. I think just in terms of the civil society work that's been going on, it would to have a much better federal tie-up between civil society organizations around the continent and their counterparts in Asia, in Europe, and the Americas. I think that is really important. And how we can get independent sources of finance for those civil society organizations, because too often now civil society organizations, whether it's in India or Egypt or Zimbabwe, they're labeled as anti-people, anti-national, and some sort of foreign agenda. So I think it's really important for these civil society organizations that are doing these investigations to have a very strong national progressive Pan-African identity. So I think that's important. And in terms of how they can reach out to their international partners and get some pressure on these type of deals, I think we have to go beyond the standard pattern of sanctions, because it's clear that the sanctions, apart from giving governments, and we've seen this very strongly in Zimbabwe, a kind of a rationale for what's going wrong with the economy, they don't actually do a lot of good, at least in the short term. They certainly don't change behavior. I mean, the Cartels report mentions the investigation into the looting of the Democratic Republic of Congo back in 2002, 2003. While those reports, those of us who were involved regarded them as pioneering reports, what they did do was get the Rwandan and the Ugandan troops out of Congo temporarily, as it happened, and the Zimbabwean and the Angolan troops out. But in terms of the business connections, they actually persisted, partly because the politicians and the military people involved in those operations in Congo also had enduring corporate investments or certainly corporate presences in Congo, and they persisted. So I think there's a need to look at going beyond the sanctions, adding to pressure on individual companies, on the facilitators, on the pinstripe army of consultants, auditors, and lawyers, and so on. There's some big names. I mean, we've seen in the state capture investigations in South Africa, we've seen McKinsey come under very heavy scrutiny. We've seen consultants in the UK and in Germany, ditto. I think there could well be more pressure on those organizations. So I think part of this is campaigning work, it's investigations, and also it's as we saw with, say, Ken Saro-Wiwa's pioneering work in Nigeria, in the Niger Delta. He was one of the first people to really make the links between environmental degradation, grand corruption, and political repression, and he did that by joining forces with another corporate empire, Body Shop, who had some sort of resonance as a kind of green type company, and then campaigned against the oil companies in the Niger Delta, and did so extremely successful, to the point actually where the dictator in Nigeria at the time, Sani Abacha, developed trumped up charges against Saro-Wiwa, and he was killed along with 7 other activists, judicially executed in effect. So I think there's some lessons to be learned from that. I think one of the positive things in terms of looking at this sort of resource monopolization by the cartels is that since those Congo reports were done, the scope for investigative and digital journalism, data journalism, has increased remarkably. We're now getting access from many more sources. There is also, despite the physical threats against people, there are many more whistleblowers than there used to be. I think there still needs to be a lot of protection for the whistleblowers, but certainly there has been a much wider access to looking into malfeasance. I think the constraints now are in terms of the numbers of trained journalists and investigators, financial and economic experts who can get access to this data and then interpret it and explain what's going on. Most of us journalists, we're generalists. We know corruption when we see it, but to the mechanisms of how it's working, how these profits are transferred, to what vehicles, and how to track these vehicles, and the pressure points on these vehicles, where don't they pay tax, where do they break international law? Those are things that we need the expert voice on. And now the expert voices are increasingly available through outfits like Tax Justice Network, the Global Financial Integrity, which has done some pioneering work on the illicit financial flows. But I think they also need a lot more political support. And I think that could come from civil society, from the trades unions, and perhaps from educational institutions with their own research facilities, and certainly put pressure on Pan-African institutions such as the African Development Bank, the African Union, which all sound the rallying call against illicit financial flows. I mean, since Thabo Mbeki produced that groundbreaking report of identifying, I think, $80 billion a year leaving Africa in financial flows, remarkably little has been done in terms of follow-up. But I think this cartel report is definitely seen as part of that. And I think it also requires quite a lot of political lobbying around the world by again, coalitions of people from Africa and activists from the US, from Europe and Asia to put their pressure. I'll just give one example in closing, which is not actually in Zimbabwe, but it shows you, I think, the new face of what's going on these sorts of issues. There's a major business mining magnate in Democratic Republic of Congo. I'm sure you've come across him, Dan Gertler. Now, he was sanctioned by, and surprisingly, by the Donald Trump presidency in 2017. They threw the book at him in the form of the global Magnitsky sanctions, which were initially intended for Russian oligarchs. And the measures are meant to be comprehensive enough to shut down your entire US dollar operations, to forbid you from doing any transactions in US dollars. So it was really bizarre that the Trump administration sort of sanctioned him. That seemed to be a kind of an independent group within the US Treasury. Maybe Michelle would know more about how that process actually happened. Suffice it to say that Gertler, who comes from Israel and had very strong ties to the Netanyahu government, fought tooth and nail against those sanctions. And in the closing weeks of the Trump administration, against all precedent and without any apparent, any supporting documentation, had those sanctions suspended for a year. And that during that year, he would be able then to extract all his US dollar assets out of the US dollar system from the US and other US dollar denominated locations and transfer it to new jurisdictions. And that came as, it was a deal signed apparently with the backing of the former Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, and Steve Mnuchin, the former Treasury Secretary. They apparently signed off on it without consulting the intelligence authorities in the US or without consulting experts on the region, the State Department. Of course, it's absolutely critical in terms of one of the biggest players in the Congo system and an ally of the former President Joseph Kabila gets a free pass on sanctions just as a kind of tussle for power at the top of Congo. What happens then is that Joe Biden is sworn in as president, and then there's investigation, and now that decision is coming under review. But one of the reasons why it's coming under review is that there is such heavy pressure from lobby groups like Sentry, from lawmakers in the Senate and in the House of Reps, and independent human rights organizations. And they're trying now to get that suspension reviewed, and in fact the full sanctions reimposed. So to do that, I think this is just an illustration of what it takes in terms of international coordination. It needs a lot of pressure and information coming from the country itself, and from the systems from the various institutions in the West where these measures are are being imposed. And the final element to this story is that there are two very brave guys who were working for a Cameroonian bank in Kinshasa, and they were auditors for this bank. It's called Afriland. They have fled the country in fear of their lives because they dared to question the Afriland's accounts with Dan Gertler. And they're now in France in hiding, but not before they left Congo. They actually accessed a lot of the accounts which show these bizarre transactions between Dan Gertler's companies in Congo and the Afriland Bank, which show an attempt to get around the US sanctions. And they are very much part of the story, but their own personal history, the fact that they had to flee for their lives from quite a comfortable existence in Kinshasa to a pretty difficult existence as exiles under physical threat in Paris, shows the costs of this sort of transparency, accountability work, but also its value, I think, at the same time. I think that's it for me.
That's great, Patrick. Thank you so much. And I think you have laid out a number of critical things. I'll just highlight three. I think you again went back to the theme of solidarity, and that solidarity is of course fueled and enabled and facilitated by information networks and research networks and investigation networks, including taking advantage of the new sort of information and digital technologies and their possibilities in terms of investigations. I think your point also around the Congo and some of that history, I think is particularly important because it especially relates to the post-2017 phenomenon because of the role of the military. And we saw in the coast leg role in the Congo that a number of the actors that were involved from the Zimbabwe military and the securocratic establishment are still the same actors that in many ways have been implicated in what we are currently talking about. And then I think also your reference to the broader illicit financial flows framework. This is increasingly an important issue for the entire continent, actually. I'm on the board of Trust Africa, which among other things works on illicit financial flows. And, you know, the cry always comes up when we're looking at things African, and somebody will say, no, but there is poverty, there is drought, there is COVID-19 and so on. How can we be expected to attain certain outcomes and objectives in terms of maybe keeping women not dying because of childbirth, or, you know, keeping children hydrated and medicated and so on, and all these other things. And it's very easy to demonstrate, as for instance, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development just did in 2020, that Africa could gain $79 billion, $89 billion by some measures, between 79 and $89 billion by just dealing with illicit financial flows, and that could finance sustainable development goals. And you could do the same with Zimbabwe, of course, in terms of demonstrating even at a very specific level, what the amount that we are losing from the gold that's being looted from the country on a monthly basis could do in terms of our hospitals, our education system, etc. So it's good that you made that link with the broader issue of illicit financial flows. And in many ways, that goes to the tenuous terrain of issues such as international sanctions regimes, questions of international systems and how they work, including the role of major powers such as the United States. And Michelle, with your location in the context of the Council on Foreign Relations, you have reflected on a number of these things and also reported on them. So over to you now, Michelle.
Great. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to join this conversation. And it's been so rich. I've learned a lot from listening to the previous presentations. my role really is you know, just kind of to respond to what I've been hearing. I think I would start with this. First, I think this event in and of itself is incredibly helpful, right? And when I first read this report, you know, my immediate worry was something that's been discussed, that this would, you know, sort of make a splash for a few days and everyone would move on because, you know, because the news cycle functions the way that it does and we're all overwhelmed. But it is such a helpful explanation, right, of how a country so rich in resources, where, you know, a very small elite seems to do very, very well, how this persists, despite the fact, you know, that the overall economic conditions for most of the Zimbabwean people just keep going from bad to worse to even worse. So I do think, you know, continuing to find ways to talk about it, to dig in, to figure out, you know, what additional detail is needed is really helpful. And I think that the more specificity that can be provided, particularly on this broader point about the kind of international networks that enable this kind of corruption and these illicit flows, the better. Because, you know, look, the debate around policy in the US when it comes to Zimbabwe is not actually dominated by the question of sanctions, right? So I feel like in a lot of the public discourse, it becomes almost all about this question of sanctions and are they unfair, and you know, the way that ZACC has sort of taken up this mantle that there's something nefarious about the targeted sanctions that exist, is that it's somehow an infringement on sovereignty or disrespectful to the continent as a whole. This is a sort of a sideshow, really. And what US policymakers want is a way to more effectively help to empower Zimbabwean citizens, right, so that they have a more significant voice in steering the country's future, and to ensure, I think it's true that US policymakers would like to ensure that we are not a part of, we are not helping the corrupt systems that are keeping the country in poverty and a degree of political and civil repression, right, to persist. So I do think that now is a particularly good time in the United States to be having this conversation with regard to Zimbabwe policy, because people are particularly attuned to the links between democratic decline writ large, including threats to democracy in our own country, and corruption and corrupt networks, the use of public office for private gain. And so I think that this is a good moment, the Biden administration, in talking about its sort of vision for trying to combat democratic decline, to band together global democracies, has woven this theme of anti-corruption very much through not just that rhetoric, but that initial planning. And so I think that there's a receptive policy audience in the US right now to thinking about, okay, what can we do to ensure that our own house is in order, that we're not a part of the problem, and then to assist those trying to work on other pieces of it. And I do think that that is, you know, I don't think that moment lasts necessarily forever. And so it's important to take advantage of it now. I also, I do want to say that I thought Annie's points were so powerful about, you know, the fact that this is, these cartels may operate in these elite spaces, but this is not in any way purely an elite phenomenon, right? It's affecting people at every level of society. And, you know, in terms of empowering folks internationally to take action, it actually matters a lot to hear those grassroots voices, right? It sort of stiffens the spine of the US policymaker when there are indications that popularly in Zimbabwean society, people are focused on this and want this addressed. And so I do think that thinking about who is empowered by this information, right? Who is empowered to demand accountability for what is exposed here is a really important question. So we certainly have our own responsibilities here in the United States, but the motivation to act, the ability to bump something up on the agenda, it really is helped when one can point to a groundswell of activism, of popular demand in a given society. And so I don't think they're necessarily two separate, equally important spheres. There's a virtuous circle there, right? Where if you have kind of grassroots engagement, it can help people at a policy-making level in the United States and elsewhere engage. The final point that sort of the thread I was pulling from this conversation that I do think has a lot of resonance in the US policy community is this question of demands on the AU, demands to actually uphold the norms that Zimbabwe and other African countries have signed up to, right? And this bigger geopolitical questions of whose norms actually matter, whose norms actually apply. Because, you know, in this report and in many, many other instances, what we're seeing is a very transactional model, right? Where sort of the rules change from day to day, depending on any given powerful individual's interests. And this idea of kind of a rule-governed framework is window dressing, right? But as far as I can tell, this is not actually at all been historically the African position. And I do think that while I'm not delusional, I don't think that the United States and the AU or any individual African country, that there's a total overlap in the Venn diagram of interests there. The US does have a really strong interest in a rule-governed international order. We believe in rules of the game. And this is, I say this with all humility, that doesn't mean we never violate the rules. And our own civil society has to be constantly holding our officials accountable. But when you look at kind of the way people have framed geopolitical competition internationally, this is a huge piece of it. And I see a lot of potential for mutually beneficial cooperation going forward and trying to kind of reinforce this idea of a rules-based order and some fidelity, right, to our own norms as stated in the documents we all sign up to and our own declarations of who we are. And the last thing I would just say is I really appreciated Patrick's discussion of the Dan Gertler case, which is eyebrow raising indeed. I have no particular insight on the Trump administration's decisions, not my crowd, but I certainly think we haven't heard the last of this in the United States. People in positions of power and influence are very deeply concerned about what has happened here.
Thank you very much, Michelle. I would detour that last point also. I would also, I think, just want to highlight just one thing, which is, I think, where you talk about norms and fidelity to the norms that we have signed on to, which is an issue that had come through very much in Annie's presentation also. And I hope that that's one thing that we can also come back to as we consolidate our takeaways in a few moments. So the last input that I would like to invite is something that we asked for, particularly because there is a lot of mention of the Nigerian experience and so on in terms of cartels, corruption, and all this. And Ugwe, among others, has been working in that space, but also internationally in terms of thinking about the intersection of issues of security, corruption, governance, etc., etc. So just a very brief response from both Michelle and Ugwe. to what has been said from where you sit. And Ogwe, I'll give you a few minutes then to come in, and then I'll open it up to everybody.
Hello? Hello?
Yeah, so we can hear you. We can hear you, Uche, and please come in, please.
Yes, thank you very much. And I've been listening to the contributions of other speakers, and I think that what in this report that it recognizes the role of actors outside Zimbabwe and indeed outside the continent in how these cartels deepen their influence and function effectively. And I think that for me as a researcher, is of a particular interest, in the way we perceive corruption, especially in the continent, and the way we frame the conversation, especially in terms of rules. There's always been this convenience in the narration of the issue of corruption and elite capture in Africa that sort of either deliberately or inadvertently minimizes the role of these external actors. And my sense is that it will be crucial to sort of connect the dots in trying to push for, especially countries, the big countries like the United States and the United Kingdom and other European countries who have one role or the other as responsible international actors to be able to prevail on individual actors or companies, that have links or that originate from these countries, to be able to behave responsibly as they will behave in Europe and in America, as when they come in to do business in Africa. And I say this especially coming from Nigeria, and Patrick had alluded to it, the behavior of some of these international oil companies and the collusion, especially in the extractive industry in the Niger Delta, and increasingly in the northwest region of Zamfara State, where there is gold, and and the fact that some of the roles of these actors are not as prominent as they should be. And as part of this also, I think that there is a need for a little more work. And I say this with recognizing what the report has done in throwing up all the issues, or most of the issues. But I think that there's a little more work for the experts around the table to do in trying to deepen the issues, unpack them. For instance, the issues of taxation, transfer pricing or mispricing, depending on who is speaking, the issues of illicit financial flows, to sort of begin to unpack them and begin to sort of rally around actors who are willing to campaign and push through, specific agenda items, especially at the international level. So I think that there's some more work to do. I welcome the report. Interestingly, there are a lot of similarities to what is happening back home in my country, Nigeria. The cartels do exist, and there is an unholy collaboration between these business actors and political actors, and it is really difficult, as it were, to sort of alter these well-lubricated networks. especially because they receive political backing, for the powers that be. So for me, there's a lot to learn from the Zimbabwe experience. There's also a lot to contribute from the Nigerian experience. But when all is said and done, I think we need to make progress. After the report, what next? What are the issues we need to identify and deepen? What are the issues we need to escalate at the international level? And what are the roles of especially indigenous African researchers and African scholars to begin to unpack these issues and make them issues of both domestic and international campaign? That's all for now from me.
Thank you so much, Uche. I think very, very clear points there from Uche in terms of, again, emphasizing the importance of deepening analysis into some of these issues. And then coming back to the critical question about what is to be done, which I would like us to tend to in earnest now. And a number of the things that have already been suggested in the presentations by all the input makers, I think, of course, are relevant and are a good starting point. So as I open up now, I would like to also ask people to emphasize as much as possible some of their thoughts about what could be done. I'll start by picking any two voices that want to come in quickly and briefly initially. Ibo, if you can also be ready, I'll then make you the third voice. I want to hear what you think. Just before that, I would just highlight briefly three broad areas that have come through. I think one is the question of transparency. How do we foster transparency of mine claims, of contracts, of awards, of joint ventures, of the different things that are being given in terms of access to natural resources, access to other assets, and transparency of things that are happening in the state domain broadly. So that looks like one broad area. And then a second broad area appeared to be how do we deepen understandings through communication, information sharing, and so on the actual impact of the activities that are taking place, so that it doesn't remain within the domain of elite conversations, but people can actually see what it means for the things that they daily are grappling with, such as not having a job, such as not being able to get treatment at a hospital, not being able to get a COVID vaccine, not being able to get anything that one needs for one's daily life. So how do we increase that space of communication and information sharing and knowledge? And then I thought a third broad area that came through is the area of norms, standards, international systems, etc. And how do we utilize those, as was evident from a number of the comments, including what Annie and Mark were raising. So I'll ask anyone to raise their hand and indicate if they want to speak, and we'll pick them. And I know that Oswald, you have been a keen thinker on some of these issues. I mean, do you have a question, a comment, just briefly?
Is Zamchia there?
Yeah. Oswald, are you still there? Okay. All right. If not, any other?
Zamchia there? Zamchia.
Yeah, Zamchia, go ahead, please.
Oh, thanks, Chairperson. Thanks to the panelists. Unfortunately, I don't have a way forward, but a question. Because what strikes me is that this is not even some kind of neo-patrimonial developmentalism, where you have the cartels systematically investing in expanded production for national economic growth, leading to some kind of broad-based accumulation, as other nations have done. Completely, this is not it, because most of these looted resources are used to fund personal wealth accumulation. I mean, if you drive in Harare, Borodale, you see embarrassing heights of consumption. I know ministers who have built, 64-bedroomed houses with ATMs inside. They just withdraw money in their bedrooms. And it's also used to sustain state coercive superstructures, you know. So there has been some suffocation of democracy. And then this is justified by some ideological niceties that we are fighting neo-imperialism, neo-colonialism, the sanctions bust, and so forth. But the classic question returns: what do you do with these cartels who are running a shadow state and a shadow economy in the context of a growing local voices for national transitional processes towards democratization? Do you throw them in jail where they belong, or you choose to concede to allow some form of movement? Thank you, Chair. That's a question to the panelists.
Yeah, thank you very much for that input. So I know that Oswald, you also had, are you ready now? You had your hand up earlier, and do you want to come in?
Yeah, certainly. Thank you, Tawanda. Well, I'm a student of governance. I'm doing a research on mineral resource governance in my PhD right now. But certainly, I think, thank you for the presentations. They're an eye-opener. I have a question and a comment. My question is that beyond Africa, do cartels exist? Do we have cartels in America, in Europe, or in China or that region? And if they are there, how have they dealt with the impact of these cartels? I've read that at some point China had an audit storm. Does it mean that Africa in general, and Zimbabwe in particular, is ready for an audit storm? That's my question. But my comment is that I think and I stand guided here, the battle that we are engaged with of governance, opaqueness of the state, processes, systems, I think it's a consequence of the wrong foundation of the African state. And that founding of the African state did not emphasize on creation of strong institutions, but strong individuals. And let me just throw it back here at home. If you look at the cabinet responsibilities, a cabinet minister manages an act of parliament. And an act of parliament is actually a whole responsibility of public entities. Throw in Ministry of Transport, for example. It has got 13, more or less, public entities under the armpit of one minister. So I think the foundation and the founding of the African state has made it that we deploy too many strong persons rather than institutions, under which their accountability models are also quite weak and undermined. And I'll close my submission by concurring on the existence of cartels. And believe you me, poor countries are running more than 3 economies, basically. There's the formal economy, there's the informal economy.
I'll ask you to wind up then also, so we can go to others.
Yes, and there is an underground economy. And the underground economy is the most versatile, the most lethal, the biggest. So that's what we continue to grapple with. Thanks, Tawanda.
Thanks a lot. That's good. So I want to ask Ibo to come in, and then I want to further open it up to a couple more people. And then in the remaining 9 minutes, we'll also move now towards consolidating our conclusions. Among the panelists, the only person I would then be able to give an opportunity is our main presenter, Mark, to be able to come in again and respond to some of what he has heard. So Ibo, please.
Thanks, Tawanda. Thank you. I won't take too long. I want to highlight the question you raised at the beginning of the discussion: what is to be done, especially in the context of policy? I think there are 2 levels. One is the local level, and in relation to the report that we are discussing. And Zamchia raised very important questions. I'd go back to the first thing, is really, how do we cause a commission of inquiry? Because I'm afraid that this report will just gather dust after some sensational reporting on it. And as Mark Haywood said, we need to cause some kind of inquiry, if it's not possible locally, at home, at least some kind of initiative from outside, leading if possible also to prosecution. There are elements in the report about which one can raise questions, including criminal issues. Secondly, the impact on the human condition in our country, the sorry state of education and health, infrastructure, so on. And therefore the need to quantify and trace the revenue losses due to illicit financial flows, and more specifically, as member Tawanda, we discussed this on the economy of corruption, the amount of money being lost. You know, we know from one report that 60% of our gold is going illicitly into South Africa. 60% of our gold. The Minister of Home Affairs admitted the other day that $100 million a month of gold revenues are being smuggled out. Is there any way we can begin from a policy point of view, but also using our experts? There's Kabemba with the Southern African Resource Watch, you've mentioned Farai Magu. Is there somewhere we can begin quantifying and monitoring revenue flows from the extractive industries, and in such a way as to raise a red flag where necessary, but to ensure at the end of the day that the revenues from extractive industries, from exports, are channeled back and invested in the community. Lastly, on my part, how do we, which was the intention behind this discussion, and Patrick raised points, anecdotal, but I think, is there any way we can begin, Uchi, Michelle, begin a systematic tracing of the tentacles of the corruption game across the world, especially right down to the heart of it, which is the global north? Is there something we can institute in terms of research and really block these exposing in the first instance? You know, there is in DC, I don't know if you're aware of it, Michelle, the Hudson Institute on the study of kleptocracy. It's such an institution that we should link with to show, and my thing is less about the morality of corruption. It's really about bread and butter issues for the people at home, and how these revenues, if we take, for example, our modest estimates that Zimbabwe could actually earn up to $12 billion from extractive industries. 12 billion. We want to get something like 2 billion. And if you take that into account, we pay our debts yesterday, but more important, could change the lives of our people. And that in that context, really, I wanted to highlight the points I've just raised. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ibo. So very clear points, no need to repeat them. I would take it that we would all be generally in agreement. I would just speak to one that you talked about, which is the question of some kind of inquiry. And I think Mark had spoken about a judicial commission as one form. We have seen the Zondo Commission in the context of South Africa. And I think we could think about an equivalent, but also there is some concerns, of course, about how much the capture extends into the judiciary in Zimbabwe. So it's important to not limit it to a judicial inquiry within Zimbabwe. But the fact that the locus of what the report is talking about is not just Zimbabwean also means that we could potentially be looking for something that is both Zimbabwean but also external international dimensions in terms of a commission. And this is as worthwhile an issue as any for a focused commission to unravel the details, including for those that are saying, oh, this is hateful, is not true, and so on. Surely they would want to be vindicated. And therefore, I think there is really the possibility there of putting some momentum behind an idea for a commission of inquiry, and people could look at the specificities in terms of who might participate in that and how might it be pressured to come by and to come up. So I'll invite any other one additional comment before going back to Mark, and we can then conclude. If there is anybody that has a pressing comment.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hi, Tawanda.
I
mean, I think there's a point made in the discussion about corruption some weeks ago by Todd Moss, who pointed out that our future is dependent on our debt. We have to pay our debt. If we don't pay our debt, then nobody's coming to the party. Now, the money is being stolen, just as Ibo has been pointed out. So that money is the extent of our debt. So it is critical that the solidarity in identifying where the money's gone, who put it there, who's facilitated it, and we identify these people so that that money can be identified. Because if we don't get that money and we don't get a vibrant Zimbabwe, the future of all the young is going to pay off the debt of the criminals who stole it. This is a really fundamental problem, actually. And I think Zimbabwean people do not understand that this rhetoric around sanctions covers up the debt problem. And that debt problem has got to be resolved. And the debt problem has got to be resolved by bringing the money back. This is an absolutely critical thing for our future. There's nowhere else we can go on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tony. Absolutely, the debt burden that we are putting as an albatross on the necks of future generations. So both present consequences, but also future consequences in terms of the social impact on the ground. So this has been immensely rich, and I think the question of sanctions that keeps coming back in one guise or another, I think it's important to also notice that, and this was addressed variously by the presenters, but even while we had, I think only yesterday, the renewal of the executive order by the US via the presidential executive order, that is, via the White House announcement on that. The reality is that it's not just the United States. I mean, even China, which has been proclaimed as the favorite body by the Zimbabwe establishment, in September of 2020, issued through its Minister of Commerce of the People's Republic of China, Order number 4 of 2020, which was essentially some kind of framework for sanctions, unreliable entity list, they called it, but which essentially is about, of course, their own foreign policy and their need to be safeguarding the integrity of transactions between persons, juridical and natural persons within China and internationals. So those are realities that we will operate in, but I think the important thing is to say from where we sit in the context of Zimbabwe, of South Africa, of Southern Africa, of Africa, how do we make sure that there is no excuse or no basis for the kinds of things that are being raised in these sanctions regimes to continue to persist. So I would like to ask Mark to have the last word in terms of any comment or response that you may have after you have heard these presentations and these interventions.
Thank you, Tawanda, and thank you for facilitating, as you said, a rich and I think important and interesting discussion. I really don't have too much to add at the end of the discussion, except to plea, as I've said a number of times, that we keep this report alive. and that we see it as, in a sense, the beginning of a work in progress. It tells us a great deal. It joins the dots, but it also points to areas for further and ongoing investigation and gathering of evidence. And obviously today has been more a discussion about the substantive issues that the report reveals. But I do think that there needs to be almost a discussion amongst a coalition of concerned parties about practical issues that can be done arising from the report. You know, in terms of the way forward, I would just draw to people's attention again, you know, that the report does end up with conclusions and recommendations. I don't think we should lose sight of those conclusions and recommendations. There are 9 different recommendations. Many of them have been canvassed in this discussion, gathering further evidence, litigation or prosecution, applying external pressure, that, you know, the change of administration in the United States, as Annie, as various people have pointed out, Annie, Michelle, is important. It gives us more space than we had previously. Leveraging Parliament's oversight role in Zimbabwe. Parliament may be neutered in certain respects, but it can still play an investigative role, and those investigations can be utilized and carried beyond a Parliament that doesn't want to, for obvious reasons, act. Safeguarding the resilience of champions in the state, engaging key institutions, reforming mineral licensing. You know, those are things that can be done internally and externally. Annie mentioned the issue of the ZACC tribunal. I think it's crucial that we should not give up on the belief that the ZACC tribunal can never be recreated or reinstated. The politics of the region has changed with the removal of President Zuma in South Africa, who played a critical hand in getting rid of the ZACC tribunal. That would be important. I think that we have to get to the full truth. The truth has a power in its own. I think we need to keep alive this idea of a commission of inquiry. I hear what Ibo says. I mean, before we had the Zondo Commission in South Africa, we had a Sariti Commission, which was actually a judge who covered up the arms deal in South Africa. So there's no guarantee in and of itself that a judicial inquiry gives you everything that you want, but there has to be consequence to this, and we must work with the belief that these cartels can be stopped, and that what they have stolen can be recovered. And we have to formulate, I think, strategies to ensure that there is a recovery of this of these funds. And you know, the last 2 points, the question was asked, do cartels exist beyond Africa? Yes, they do. And they act corruptly beyond Africa as well. But you know, in a number of other countries, the institutions, the regulatory regime for dealing with cartels is much stronger. Part of cartel capture has involved breaking down the institutional framework to control cartels. So we must try to build it up. And then I'd conclude just by going back to where I started, which is that I think the media has a critical role to play in Zimbabwe and outside of Zimbabwe as well. And certainly I'm very happy from relative safety of where I am with Maverick Citizen in South Africa to continue to play a role to expose and publicize things that people are afraid of doing so from within the country, and in that way aiding, as Annie said, conflict-sensitive methodologies and ways of researching and reporting. But thank you very much for organizing this important dialogue. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mark. And it only remains for me to say thank you to Mark for the presentation. Thanks to Annie, to Patrick, to Michelle, to Uche, The responses, I think, as they came in, were excellent and very, very helpful. I think the comments also that various people have input have been immensely helpful. And I think it is also testament just in terms of the attendance and some of the great people that I won't mention by name that are on the attendance list that are doing tremendous work in this area, that this is a serious issue, that people are determined that this not be a 9-day wonder, that they want to keep the focus on this, that there will be ways to follow up in the various ways that Ibo and others you were suggesting. Back to you, Ibo, in terms of concluding the convening. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Tawanda. Before thanking you, good job done. Just to thank our panelists, in particular Mark. I think you've done a very good job, not only in publishing the report, but also in speaking to it as you have done so well. And Patrick, Annie, Uchi, and I'm forgetting names now. Michelle, thank you very much indeed. I think this, as Mark has said, this is only the beginning. We have to follow through the recommendations, but more important, the discussions that we have had today. Tawanda, you've done a very good job. Thank you very much indeed. I want to say that there is a necessary relationship between every one of our policy dialogues, and we'd like to broach in the next fortnight the subjects broached today in terms of the way forward in Zimbabwe. The paper that was published this morning, and which we hope Mark Haywood would publish in Daily Maverick, if also because we want that to get to the heart of the South African bureaucracy, the political actors in that country, in dealing with the Zimbabwe situation. The Cartels report is in many ways a reflection of the pathology that is Zimbabwe today. And it has helped a lot to highlight the nature of the crisis. And I think we need to sustain the pressure in terms of highlighting the elements that constitute the crisis. And we hope that next fortnight, and we'd like your ideas, those of you on this platform, on the kind of framing of the discussion as to the way forward with respect to resolving the Zimbabwe crisis. So again, thank you all. We had a very good attendance. And as I said earlier, the discussion is recorded on Facebook. It will be in the next half an hour or so on YouTube. It's been transcribed. It will be in hard copy, and you'll be seeing it again. Thank you very much. Tawanda, thank you.
Oyo ya boye